Lieutenant Shoji Takeda pressed his face against the chain-link fence, watching something that made no sense. American soldiers, the same men who had captured him on Iwo Jima just months before, were laughing. Not the cruel laughter of victors over the defeated, but genuine joy as they threw a white leather ball back and forth under the blazing Hawaiian sun. One guard, a tall sergeant with kind eyes, noticed Takeda watching and did something unthinkable. He walked toward the fence, baseball glove in hand, and smiled. What happened next would shatter everything Takeda thought he knew about his enemies and prove that even in the darkest times of war, humanity could find a way to shine through. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of April 15, 1946, began like every other day at the Honouliuli internment camp in Hawaii. The sun rose mercilessly over the volcanic landscape, casting long shadows across the barracks where nearly 4,000 Japanese prisoners of war tried to find meaning in another day of captivity. Among them was Lieutenant Shoji Takeda, a 26-year-old pilot whose Zero fighter had been shot down over the Pacific 8 months earlier. His body had healed from the crash, but his spirit remained as broken as the day he was pulled from the wreckage. Takeda sat on his thin mattress staring at his hands. These same hands had once gripped the controls of one of Japan's most advanced aircraft, diving through clouds at 300 miles per hour toward American ships. Now they trembled slightly as he reached for the metal cup that held his morning portion of rice and vegetables. The transformation from warrior to prisoner had been more devastating than any physical wound he could have sustained. The barracks around him buzzed with quiet conversation in Japanese. His fellow prisoners spoke of home, of families they might never see again, of honor lost and futures uncertain. Takeda rarely joined these discussions. Since his capture, he had withdrawn into himself, spending most of his time observing the Americans who guarded them with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep-seated resentment. Through the small window beside his bunk, he could see across the compound to where the American soldiers lived in their own quarters. Even from this distance, the contrast was stark. The Americans moved with purpose and energy, their voices carrying laughter and casual conversation. They played music from portable radios, wrote letters home with confident strokes, and seemed genuinely at ease, despite being thousands of miles from their own country. This morning, however, something different was happening in the American section of the camp. A group of soldiers had gathered in the open area between their barracks, and they were engaged in some kind of organized activity that Takeda had never seen before. One man stood holding a long wooden stick, while another crouched behind him in an unusual position. A third soldier stood far away, threw something small and white through the air, and suddenly the man with the stick swung it with tremendous force. The white object flew high into the air, and all the soldiers began running and shouting with excitement. Takeda watched, fascinated despite himself, as the men chased the small white ball across the dusty ground. When one of them caught it, the others cheered and slapped each other on the back, as if they had accomplished something of great importance. "What are they doing?" asked Corporal Kenji Nakamura, a young soldier who had been captured during the battle for Saipan. He had noticed Takeda's intense focus on the Americans, and had come over to see what was so interesting. "I do not know," Takeda replied, never taking his eyes off the scene. Some kind of military training, perhaps. But as he continued to watch, it became clear that this was not military training. The Americans were playing, engaging in some form of recreation that brought them obvious joy. The realization troubled Takeda deeply. In his mind, Americans were supposed to be cold, calculating enemies, focused entirely on destroying Japan and everything it represented. This display of carefree playfulness did not fit with the image of ruthless warriors that had been drilled into him since childhood. Over the following days, Takeda found himself drawn to the fence that separated the prisoner section from the American quarters whenever this mysterious activity was taking place. He learned to anticipate the times when the soldiers would gather with their wooden sticks and white ball. Other prisoners began to notice his interest, and soon a small group would join him at the fence to watch what they all agreed was a very strange American custom. The game, whatever it was, seemed to follow specific rules that the prisoners could not understand. Sometimes the man with the stick would swing and miss the ball entirely, causing his teammates to groan in disappointment. Other times, he would hit it so perfectly that it would sail over the heads of all the other players, and the celebration that followed was infectious even to the watching prisoners. One afternoon, as Takeda stood at his usual position along the fence, he noticed that one of the American soldiers was watching him back. The man was tall and lean, with sandy brown hair and a face that spoke of both strength and kindness. His uniform identified him as a sergeant, and he seemed to be one of the more skilled players of this mysterious game. The sergeant's name was Paul Henderson, though Takeda would not learn this for several more days. Henderson was 28 years old, from a small farming town in Nebraska, and he had been stationed at Anyuliuli for 6 months. Unlike many of his fellow guards, Henderson had developed a genuine curiosity about the Japanese prisoners under his watch. He had noticed the small group that gathered at the fence during baseball games, and he was particularly intrigued by the intense focus of the pilot who stood slightly apart from the others. Henderson had grown up playing baseball in wheat fields and vacant lots, and the game represented some of his happiest memories from before the war. When he watched the Japanese prisoners, observing their games with such obvious interest, he began to wonder if sport might be a bridge across the vast cultural and linguistic divide that separated them. The opportunity to test this theory came on a particularly warm afternoon in early May. The regular baseball game was winding down, and most of the American soldiers had wandered off to other activities. Henderson found himself standing near the fence with his glove still on his hand, looking directly at Takeda, who was in his usual observation spot. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other across the chain-link barrier. Henderson could see intelligence in the Japanese officer's eyes, along with something that looked like longing. On impulse, Henderson pulled off his glove and tossed it over the fence. The leather glove landed with a soft thud in the dust at Takeda's feet. The Japanese pilot stared down at it as if it were a live snake, then looked back up at Henderson with complete bewilderment. "You want to try?" Henderson asked in English, accompanying his words with gestures that mimicked throwing and catching. Takeda's first instinct was to step back from the fence. Fraternizing with the enemy was not only against regulations, but went against everything he had been taught about maintaining dignity in captivity. Yet something about the American's expression, the genuine friendliness in his eyes, made Takeda hesitate. Behind him, the other prisoners had gone silent. They were watching this unexpected interaction with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some whispered warnings about American tricks and the importance of maintaining proper distance from their captors. But Takeda found himself bending down to pick up the glove. The leather was soft and worn, shaped by countless hours of use. He slipped his hand inside and was surprised by how natural it felt, as if his fingers had been designed for this purpose. Henderson grinned and jogged back to retrieve a baseball from the equipment bag. He returned to the fence and held up the white sphere, pointing to Takeda and then to himself. The message was clear. He wanted to play catch. What followed was awkward at first. Takeda had never seen a baseball up close, let alone tried to catch one. Henderson's first gentle throw bounced off the lieutenant's glove and rolled away into the dust. The watching prisoners murmured in what sounded like disappointment, but Henderson just smiled encouragingly and retrieved the ball. "Like this," Henderson said, demonstrating the proper way to position the glove. He threw again, even more gently, and this time Takeda managed to trap the ball against his chest. The small success brought an unexpected surge of satisfaction. Takeda had always been athletically inclined, and his pilot training had given him excellent hand-eye coordination. He threw the ball back toward Henderson, though his form was completely wrong, and the ball went wide. Henderson chased down the errant throw and returned it with patience and good humor. Gradually, over the course of 20 minutes, Takeda began to understand the basic mechanics of catching and throwing. His throws became more accurate, and he started to anticipate the ball's trajectory when Henderson threw to him. Other prisoners had moved closer to the fence, drawn by this unprecedented interaction. Among them was Corporal Nakamura, whose English was better than most. He began translating some of Henderson's encouragement for the others, and soon there was a small crowd of fascinated observers on both sides of the fence. The impromptu lesson came to an end when another American soldier approached, and reminded Henderson that he had duties to attend to. But before leaving, the sergeant pointed to himself and said clearly, "Paul." Then he pointed to Takeda and raised his eyebrows questioningly. "Shoji," Takeda replied, after a moment's hesitation. It was the first word he had spoken to an American since his capture. Paul Henderson nodded and smiled. "Tomorrow, Shoji?" he asked, making throwing motions again. Takeda found himself nodding before he had consciously decided to agree. As Henderson walked away, waving goodbye, Takeda stood holding the baseball glove and wondering what exactly had just happened to him. That evening, the prisoner barracks were alive with discussion about the day's unprecedented events. Some of the men were critical of Takeda's interaction with the American Guard, arguing that it showed weakness and lack of proper spirit. Others were curious about the game itself and asked detailed questions about how it was played. Takeda lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the feel of the baseball in his hand and the genuine warmth in Paul Henderson's smile. For months, he had seen Americans only as faceless enemies, the people responsible for his captivity and his country's suffering. But Paul had treated him not as a defeated foe, but as a fellow human being interested in learning something new. The next afternoon, Takeda found himself at the fence again, though he told himself he was only there to return the borrowed glove. Paul Henderson was waiting for him, and this time he had brought 2 other soldiers with him. One was a shorter man with dark hair and laughing eyes, and the other was tall and serious-looking with prematurely gray hair. "This is Mike," Paul said, indicating the shorter soldier, "and this is Lieutenant Davis." The gray-haired man nodded formally, while Mike waved enthusiastically. What followed was Takeda's first real lesson in baseball fundamentals. The Americans had brought several gloves and balls, and they proceeded to demonstrate the basic skills of the game. They showed him how to hold the ball for different types of throws, how to position his body when catching, and how to swing the wooden bat they called it. More prisoners had gathered to watch, and Paul Henderson seemed to realize that he had an opportunity to include more than just one man in this cultural exchange. He began tossing additional gloves over the fence, encouraging others to join in. Corporal Nakamura was the first to accept a glove, followed by Private Hiroshi Tanaka, a quiet man who had been a teacher before the war. Soon there were 6 Japanese prisoners lined up along their side of the fence, throwing balls back and forth with 6 American soldiers on the other side. The language barrier created some amusing moments. When Paul tried to explain the concept of the strike zone, his gestures and broken attempts at Japanese words sent both sides into fits of laughter. Nakamura's translations sometimes made things more confusing rather than clearer, especially when he tried to explain American slang terms that had no Japanese equivalent. But gradually, understanding began to emerge. The prisoners learned that the game was called baseball, and that it was extremely popular throughout America. The Americans learned that none of their new students had ever seen anything like it before, though some of the movements reminded them of traditional Japanese games they had played as children. Lieutenant Davis, who initially had been skeptical about this unofficial cultural exchange, found himself genuinely impressed by how quickly the Japanese prisoners picked up the basic skills. Takeda, in particular, showed natural talent for hitting the ball with the bat. His pilot's reflexes and ability to track moving objects served him well in this new endeavor. As the days passed, these informal baseball lessons became a regular occurrence. Word spread throughout both the prisoner and guard populations, and the afternoon games began attracting larger crowds. Some guards were uncomfortable with the friendly interaction between captors and captives, but the camp commandant, Colonel William Roberts, decided to allow the activities to continue after observing them personally. Colonel Roberts was a thoughtful man who had spent considerable time thinking about the purpose of internment camps and the treatment of prisoners of war. He believed that maintaining the humanity and dignity of captured enemies was not only morally correct, but also strategically wise for America's long-term interests in the Pacific. When he watched Japanese prisoners and American guards laughing together over a baseball game, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate American values in action. The breakthrough moment came 3 weeks into these daily sessions. Paul Henderson had been working with Takeda on batting technique, and the Japanese pilot had been struggling with his timing. American pitching was faster and more varied than anything he had experienced during their practice sessions. On this particular afternoon, Mike volunteered to pitch to Takeda, while Paul provided coaching from the sidelines. The first few pitches resulted in swings and misses, but Paul could see that Takeda was getting closer to making solid contact. "Wait for your pitch," Paul called out, not sure if Takeda understood the concept, but hoping his tone conveyed the message. "Don't try to hit everything." Mike wound up and threw a perfect fastball right down the middle of the strike zone. Takeda's swing was smooth and level, and the crack of the bat meeting the ball rang out across the camp like a gunshot. The ball sailed high and far, clearing the heads of all the fielders and landing well beyond the designated playing area. The cheer that went up from both sides of the fence was spontaneous and heartfelt. American soldiers and Japanese prisoners celebrated together, united in appreciation for a perfectly executed piece of athletic skill. Takeda stood at the improvised home plate, bat still in his hands, with an expression of pure joy on his face. For Paul Henderson, watching Takeda's reaction to his first home run was a moment of profound revelation. Here was a man who had been trained to kill Americans, who had probably succeeded in doing so during combat, and who had every reason to hate his captors. Yet in this moment, he was experiencing simple human happiness that transcended nationality, language, and the circumstances that had brought them together. The success of that home run seemed to unlock something in Takeda. Over the following days, he became more animated and engaged, not just during baseball activities, but in all aspects of camp life. He began attempting to speak English with the guards, started asking questions about American customs and culture, and even volunteered to help translate for other prisoners who wanted to participate in the baseball games. Other prisoners noticed the change in their former pilot and began to follow his lead. The daily baseball sessions expanded from simple catch-and-hit drills to actual games with improvised rules that accommodated the language barrier and the physical separation created by the fence. These games were chaotic affairs that bore only passing resemblance to regulation baseball, but they were filled with laughter and friendly competition. Teams were mixed, with Americans and Japanese players working together despite being on opposite sides of the chain-link barrier. Communication happened through gestures, broken phrases in each other's languages, and the universal language of athletic competition. Paul Henderson found himself looking forward to these afternoon sessions with an enthusiasm that surprised him. Before the war, he had been a high school mathematics teacher who coached the baseball team as a secondary duty. Working with the Japanese prisoners reminded him of the pure joy he had felt teaching young people new skills and watching them develop confidence and competence. The cultural exchange began extending beyond baseball. During breaks in the games, prisoners and guards would attempt to teach each other words in their respective languages. Takeda learned to say, "good throw," and "nice catch" in English, while Paul struggled with basic Japanese phrases like arigato for thank you and sayonara for goodbye. These interactions led to discussions about life before the war. Through Nakamura's translation, the Americans learned that Takeda had been a university student studying engineering before joining the Imperial Navy. Paul shared stories about his life as a teacher and his family farm in Nebraska. The guards learned that many of the prisoners had been conscripted rather than career soldiers, while the prisoners discovered that most of the Americans were equally reluctant warriors who wanted nothing more than to return home. The baseball games also created an informal economy of sorts. Prisoners began crafting small wooden figures and decorative items to trade with guards for better baseball equipment. Some of the more skilled craftsmen made miniature bats and balls as gifts for the Americans, while guards shared candy, cigarettes, and American magazines with their Japanese teammates. Colonel Roberts continued to monitor these developments with interest and growing approval. Reports from his staff indicated that disciplinary problems among the Japanese prisoners had decreased significantly since the baseball activities began. There were fewer incidents of depression and despair, less tension between different prisoner factions, and a general improvement in camp morale. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, the prisoners involved in the baseball program were proving to be valuable sources of information about Japanese military procedures and equipment. not because they were being interrogated or coerced, but because they were voluntarily sharing information in the context of friendly conversation. The program faced its first serious challenge in late June, when a group of high-ranking Japanese officers who had been recently transferred to Honolulu from another camp expressed strong disapproval of the baseball activities. These men, led by Major Tetsuo Yamamoto, argued that fraternizing with the enemy was dishonorable and detrimental to maintaining proper military discipline among the prisoners. Major Yamamoto was a career officer from an old military family who had been captured during the final assault on Okinawa. He represented the traditional samurai warrior culture that viewed any accommodation with enemies as a form of betrayal. When he arrived at Honolulu and witnessed Japanese prisoners playing games with American guards, he was genuinely shocked and outraged. The major immediately began organizing opposition to the baseball program among the prisoners. He argued that the activities were part of an American psychological warfare campaign designed to weaken Japanese resolve and make them more compliant. He demanded that all prisoners immediately cease participating in these games and return to maintaining proper distance from their captors. This conflict put Takeda and the other baseball enthusiasts in a difficult position. In Japanese military culture, rank and seniority commanded absolute respect, and Major Yamamoto outranked everyone involved in the program. Moreover, his arguments carried the weight of traditional honor codes that had been drilled into every Japanese soldier from the moment they entered military service. The confrontation came to a head during one of the afternoon baseball sessions. Major Yamamoto approached the fence with a group of supporters and began loudly criticizing the prisoners who were participating. His words were harsh and formal, delivered in the commanding tone of a senior officer addressing insubordinate troops. Takeda found himself caught between two worlds. On one side was the traditional military discipline and cultural loyalty that had defined his entire adult life. On the other was the genuine friendship and human connection he had discovered through baseball with Paul Henderson and the other American guards. Paul could see that something serious was happening, even though he couldn't understand the rapid Japanese being spoken near the fence. The body language and tone made it clear that the new arrival was angry about the baseball activities. Several of the regular prisoner participants looked uncomfortable and uncertain. The crisis deepened when Major Yamamoto directly ordered Takeda to remove the baseball glove he was wearing and step away from the fence. The command was delivered in front of both American guards and Japanese prisoners, making it impossible to ignore or deflect. For a long moment, Takeda stood frozen, the baseball glove on his hand feeling heavier than the flight controls of his Zero fighter. He could feel the eyes of everyone present focused on him, waiting to see whether he would obey the major's order or continue with the activity that had brought him the first genuine happiness he had experienced since his Arab capture. Finally, Takeda spoke, and his words surprised everyone present, including himself. "With respect, Major," he said in Japanese, "I believe these activities serve an important purpose. They help us maintain our physical fitness, provide mental stimulation, and demonstrate the honor of Japanese people through fair competition." The argument that followed was intense and deeply personal. Major Yamamoto accused Takeda of being corrupted by American propaganda and forgetting his duty as a Japanese officer. Takeda responded by arguing that showing Americans the dignity and skill of Japanese people was itself a form of service to the emperor. Other prisoners began taking sides in the debate. Some supported the major's position, arguing for strict adherence to traditional military protocols. Others backed Takeda, saying that the baseball games had improved their morale and physical condition in ways that benefited everyone. Paul Henderson and the American guards watched this drama unfold with fascination and concern. They could see that their informal cultural exchange program had become the center of a significant controversy, but they were powerless to intervene in what was clearly an internal Japanese military matter. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Corporal Nakamura, whose English skills had made him a valuable translator throughout the baseball program, stepped forward and addressed Major Yamamoto directly. "Sir," he said formally, "perhaps you would be willing to observe one of our games before making a final decision about their value. We would be honored to demonstrate the skills we have learned and the respect we maintain for Japanese military traditions even while engaging in this American sport." End quote. It was a brilliant diplomatic move. Nakamura had framed the request in terms of traditional military courtesy, while simultaneously challenging the major to judge the program based on direct observation rather than preconceptions. Major Yamamoto could not refuse such a request without appearing unreasonable. He agreed to watch one baseball game, though he made it clear that his approval was far from guaranteed. The game that followed was unlike any that had taken place during the previous weeks. The prisoners involved played with intense focus and dedication, determined to show that their participation in baseball enhanced rather than diminished their dignity as Japanese soldiers. Every throw was precise, every swing was controlled, and every play was executed with the kind of attention to detail that characterized the best of Japanese military training. Paul Henderson and the American Guards also seemed to understand the importance of this particular game. They played their best baseball, demonstrating the skills and sportsmanship that made the sport such an integral part of American culture. But the most significant moment came when Takeda, playing in what had become his usual position, made an incredible diving catch that prevented the Americans from scoring a run. As he rolled to his feet, ball securely in his glove, both sides erupted in spontaneous applause. Major Yamamoto watched this display with growing amazement. He could see that the Japanese prisoners were not being degraded or humiliated by their participation in baseball. Instead, they were demonstrating qualities that any military officer would admire: quick thinking, physical coordination, teamwork, and competitive spirit. When the game ended, the major approached Takeda with a completely different demeanor than he had shown earlier. "Lieutenant," he said formally, "I can see that you and your men have found a way to maintain your honor while engaging in this activity. Perhaps I was too hasty in my judgment." The major's change of heart did more than just resolve the immediate crisis. His approval gave legitimacy to the baseball program among all the Japanese prisoners, including those who had been reluctant to participate because of concerns about propriety and military discipline. Over the following weeks, the program expanded dramatically. More prisoners joined the daily games, and the level of play improved as competition intensified. Some of the newer participants, including Major Yamamoto himself, proved to be remarkably skilled athletes who brought new strategies and techniques to the games. The cultural exchange also deepened and became more sophisticated. Prisoners began teaching Americans traditional Japanese games and martial arts demonstrations, while guards shared other aspects of American culture beyond baseball. There were informal language lessons, discussions about literature and philosophy, and even collaborative art projects that combined Japanese and American artistic traditions. Paul Henderson found himself at the center of something much larger than he had ever imagined when he first tossed that baseball glove over the fence. What had started as a simple gesture of friendliness had evolved into a comprehensive cultural exchange program that was changing the lives of everyone involved. The transformation was perhaps most dramatic in Takeda himself. The withdrawn, bitter pilot who had spent months staring at the fence in resentment had become an enthusiastic participant in camp life who served as an unofficial ambassador between the prisoner and guard populations. His English improved rapidly, and he began helping to organize activities and resolve conflicts between the two groups. But Takeda's personal growth extended beyond language skills and diplomatic abilities. The daily baseball games had given him something he had not realized he was missing: a sense of purpose and achievement that was entirely separate from military service and national conflict. When he successfully completed a difficult play or helped a newer prisoner learn a skill, he experienced satisfaction that had nothing to do with defeating enemies or serving political causes. This realization was both liberating and troubling. Takeda had spent his entire adult life defining himself in terms of service to the emperor and opposition to Japan's enemies. Now he was discovering that identity could be built around universal human experiences like friendship, learning, and simple enjoyment of physical activity. The summer of 1946 brought new challenges and opportunities to the Anyuliuli camp. As the war in the Pacific had been over for nearly a year, discussions about repatriation and the future of the prisoners became more frequent. Some men would be returning to Japan soon, while others faced the prospect of remaining in American custody for extended periods while war crimes investigations were completed. These developments added urgency to the relationships that had developed through the baseball program. Both prisoners and guards realized that their time together was limited, and many wanted to make the most of the cultural exchange while it was still possible. Paul Henderson began working on a special project during his off-duty hours. Using his background in education and his observations of the baseball program, he started writing a detailed report about the benefits of recreational and cultural exchange activities in prisoner of war camps. He hoped that his documentation might lead to similar programs being established at other facilities. The report included detailed observations about improved prisoner morale, reduced disciplinary problems, enhanced cooperation with camp administration, and the valuable intelligence that had been gathered through voluntary prisoner conversations. But Paul also wrote extensively about the human dimension of the program and the ways it had changed his own understanding of the men he was guarding. Before the baseball program began, he wrote in one section, "I saw the Japanese prisoners primarily as former enemies who represented a continuing security risk. I understood intellectually that they were human beings with families and personal histories. But this knowledge had little emotional reality for me. Through daily interaction around a shared activity, I have come to know many of these men as individuals with unique personalities, talents, and dreams for the future." Paul's report also documented the remarkable athletic abilities of many of the prisoners. Several had become skilled enough baseball players to compete favorably with American guards who had been playing the sport since childhood. Some showed particular talent for specific positions, while others demonstrated leadership abilities that made them natural team captains and coaches. The most gifted athlete in the entire program was, without question, Lieutenant Takeda. His combination of natural coordination, competitive drive, and analytical intelligence made him excel at every aspect of the game. He could hit for both power and accuracy, field his position with remarkable range and sure hands, and had developed into an excellent strategic thinker who could anticipate plays before they developed. But Takeda's greatest contribution to the program was his ability to serve as a bridge between the American and Japanese participants. His improving English and his genuine enthusiasm for the sport made him an ideal translator, not just of language, but of cultural concepts that were difficult to communicate across the divide. When American players tried to explain the concept of a clutch hit or the importance of playing for the team, Takeda was able to find Japanese equivalents that conveyed not just the literal meaning, but the emotional significance of these ideas. Similarly, when Japanese players wanted to share concepts from their own athletic traditions, Takeda could help Americans understand the deeper cultural values that were being expressed. The program's success began attracting attention beyond the boundaries of Honolulu camp. Military officials from other prisoner of war facilities visited to observe the baseball games and cultural exchange activities. Some came as skeptics who expected to find security problems or evidence that the prisoners were being treated too leniently. Instead, they found a model of how former enemies could be transformed into cooperative participants in their own rehabilitation. One of these visitors was Brigadier General Robert Morrison, who was responsible for overseeing all prisoner of war operations in the Pacific Theater. General Morrison had initially been suspicious of reports about baseball games between guards and prisoners, suspecting that camp discipline had become dangerously relaxed. However, his visit to Honolulu coincided with one of the most impressive baseball games of the entire summer. The Japanese and American players had organized a formal tournament with teams that mixed nationalities, and the level of play was remarkably high. More importantly, the level of mutual respect and sportsmanship was exactly what military leaders hoped to see in any well-run facility. General Morrison was particularly impressed when he witnessed Takeda successfully coaching a young American guard who was struggling with his batting technique. The sight of a former enemy pilot patiently teaching an American soldier how to improve his baseball swing struck the general as a perfect metaphor for the kind of post-war reconciliation that would be necessary for lasting peace in the Pacific. After observing the games and interviewing participants on both sides, General Morrison authorized the expansion of recreational programs to other prisoner of war camps throughout the Pacific. He also approved Paul Henderson's request to develop a formal curriculum for cultural exchange activities that could be implemented wherever American forces were guarding Japanese prisoners. This official recognition brought new resources to the Honolulu program, but it also brought new pressures and expectations. What had begun as spontaneous friendship between individual guards and prisoners was now being studied and evaluated as a potential model for international relations. Some participants worried that the bureaucratization of their activities would destroy the natural camaraderie that had made the program successful. There were concerns that formal rules and objectives would replace the organic development of relationships that had been the real heart of their success. These fears proved to be largely unfounded. The baseball games continued with the same enthusiasm and genuine friendship that had characterized them from the beginning. If anything, the official support made it possible to improve the quality of equipment and expand the range of activities beyond just baseball to include other sports and cultural exchanges. The autumn of 1946 brought the first significant departures from Honolulu as groups of prisoners were approved for repatriation to Japan. The prospect of saying goodbye to friends created a bittersweet atmosphere that affected everyone involved in the baseball program. Takeda was among the first groups scheduled for repatriation, having been cleared of any involvement in war crimes and classified as a low-security risk. The news of his impending departure was met with mixed emotions by both prisoners and guards, who had come to rely on his leadership and translation skills. Paul Henderson felt the approaching separation more acutely than he had expected. Over the months of daily interaction, he and Takeda had developed a friendship that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. They had shared stories about their families, their pre-war careers, and their hopes for the future. Paul had even taught Takeda some basic farming techniques from his Nebraska background, while Takeda had shared his knowledge of engineering and aviation. As Takeda's departure date approached, the baseball games took on a special significance. Everyone wanted to make sure that the remaining time was filled with the best possible experiences and memories. The quality of play reached new heights as participants pushed themselves to demonstrate skills they had developed and to create moments that would be remembered long after the war and internment were just historical footnotes. The final game before Takeda's departure was organized as a special ceremony, honoring all the prisoners who would be leaving in the first repatriation group. Teams were carefully selected to include the best players from both sides, and the game was played with an intensity and skill level that would have impressed spectators at any professional ballpark. Takeda played magnificently, recording several spectacular defensive plays and driving in the winning run with a perfectly timed hit in the bottom of the ninth inning. As he rounded the bases, both American guards and Japanese prisoners stood and applauded, recognizing not just his athletic achievement, but his contribution to the remarkable transformation that had taken place at Honolulu camp. After the game, there was an informal ceremony where participants exchanged gifts and personal mementos. Paul Henderson presented Takeda with the baseball glove that had started their friendship, along with a baseball signed by all the American guards who had participated in the program. Takeda, in turn, gave Paul a small wooden carving that depicted a baseball player in mid-swing, crafted during the long camp evenings by one of the most skilled Japanese artisans among the prisoners. The goodbyes were emotional affairs that surprised everyone with their intensity. Men who had been trained to see each other as mortal enemies were parting as genuine friends, and the reality of that transformation was almost overwhelming to contemplate. "When I return to Japan," Takeda told Paul through Nakamura's translation, "I will tell people about the Americans I met, who showed me kindness and friendship when they could have shown only hatred. Perhaps this will help both our countries build a better future together." Paul's response was equally heartfelt. "You and your friends have taught me that enemies are just people we haven't gotten to know yet. That's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life." The departure of Takeda and the other repatriated prisoners marked the beginning of the end for the baseball program at Honolulu. Though activities continued for several more months as additional groups of prisoners were processed for return to Japan, each departure reduced the number of participants and changed the dynamics of the cultural exchange. But the spirit of friendship and mutual respect that had been established continued to characterize interactions between the remaining prisoners and their American guards. Paul Henderson's formal report on the baseball program was eventually published as a military training manual and distributed to prisoner-of-war facilities around the world. His documentation of the activities at Honolulu became a case study in effective prisoner management and post-conflict reconciliation that influenced military policy for decades to come. But for Paul personally, the most important outcome of the baseball program was not its contribution to military strategy or international relations. It was the profound change in his understanding of human nature and the possibilities for friendship across cultural and political divides. Years later, after returning to his teaching career in Nebraska, Paul would often tell his students about his experiences with Japanese prisoners of war in Hawaii. He would describe the gradual development of trust and friendship through the simple act of playing baseball together, and he would emphasize the importance of seeing individual humanity even in people who are officially classified as enemies. "The greatest lesson I learned during the war," he would tell his classes, "was not about military strategy or weapon systems. It was about the power of sport and shared activities to break down barriers between people who think they have nothing in common." Some of his students would be skeptical of stories about American soldiers playing baseball with Japanese prisoners, especially in the immediate aftermath of such a bitter and destructive war. But Paul would always emphasize that the transformation had not happened overnight and that it required genuine effort and good faith from participants on both sides. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, Shoji Takeda was experiencing his own challenges in readjusting to life in post-war Japan. The country he returned to in late 1946 was devastated by years of conflict and struggling to rebuild both its physical infrastructure and its national identity. For former military personnel like Takeda, the transition was particularly difficult as they tried to find their place in a society that was rapidly abandoning the values and traditions that had defined their pre-war existence. Takeda settled in Tokyo, where he used his engineering background to find work with one of the companies involved in reconstruction efforts. The city was a maze of rubble and temporary structures, but there was an energy and determination in the air that reminded him of the competitive spirit he had experienced during the baseball games at Honolulu. However, Takeda discovered that his fellow Japanese were not always receptive to his stories about friendship with American guards. Many people were bitter about the occupation and suspicious of anyone who spoke positively about interactions with their former enemies. Some accused him of being naive, or, worse, of having been corrupted by American propaganda during his captivity. These reactions were painful for Takeda, but they also strengthened his conviction that the experiences he had shared with Paul Henderson and the other Americans were important and worth preserving. He began writing detailed accounts of the baseball program, documenting not just the activities themselves, but the gradual process of building trust and understanding between former enemies. His writings were initially published in small magazines and journals that focused on veterans' experiences, but they gradually attracted wider attention as Japan began the long process of reconciling its wartime past with its democratic future. Takeda's message that former enemies could become friends through shared activities and mutual respect resonated with many Japanese who were struggling to understand their place in the post-war world. The baseball program at Honolulu had planted seeds that continued to grow in unexpected ways. Several of the American guards who had participated went on to careers in education, international relations, and military service where they applied lessons learned from their interactions with Japanese prisoners. Some became advocates for more humane treatment of prisoners in future conflicts, while others worked to promote cultural exchange programs that could prevent the kind of misunderstandings that had contributed to the Pacific War. Corporal Nakamura, the translator who had played such a crucial role in facilitating communication during the baseball games, returned to Japan and eventually became a teacher himself. He incorporated lessons about cross-cultural understanding and the importance of seeing individual humanity in all people into his curriculum, using his experiences at Honolulu as concrete examples of how former enemies could find common ground. Major Yamamoto, the senior officer who had initially opposed the baseball program before becoming one of its strongest supporters, took a different path. He became involved in veterans organizations that worked to help former soldiers readjust to civilian life, and he often spoke about the importance of maintaining dignity and honor while also remaining open to new experiences and relationships. The impact of the Onulili baseball program extended far beyond the individual participants. Military historians and social scientists began studying the activities as an example of how recreational programs could contribute to successful prisoner management and post-conflict reconciliation. The documentation provided by Paul Henderson and others became the foundation for policies and procedures that were implemented in subsequent conflicts around the world. In 1952, 6 years after the end of the baseball program, Paul Henderson received an unexpected letter from Japan. It was written in carefully crafted English by Shoji Takeda, who had tracked down his former guard's address through military records and international correspondence networks. The letter described Takeda's life in post-war Japan, his work in reconstruction efforts, and his continuing efforts to share the story of their friendship with other Japanese people. But more importantly, it contained an invitation for Paul to visit Japan as Takeda's personal guest, to see the country that was emerging from the ashes of war, and to continue their friendship in a context of peace, rather than captivity. Paul was initially hesitant about making such a journey. The memories of the war were still fresh, and he was not sure how he would be received in a country where Americans had so recently been hated enemies. But his wife encouraged him to accept the invitation, recognizing that the friendship he had formed with Takeda had been one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. The reunion took place in Tokyo in the spring of 1953. Paul's arrival at Haneda Airport was emotional for both men, as they saw each other for the first time without the chain-link fence that had separated them during their daily baseball games. Takeda had brought his family to meet Paul, including his wife and young son, and the introduction was conducted with the same mixture of formality and genuine warmth that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. During Paul's 2-week stay in Japan, Takeda took him on a comprehensive tour of the country, showing him both the destruction that remained from the war and the impressive reconstruction efforts that were already transforming Japanese society. They visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where Paul confronted the devastating consequences of the atomic weapons that had ended the war, and they also toured modern factories and schools that represented Japan's hope for the future. But perhaps most significantly, they organized several baseball games with local Japanese teams, using the sport that had brought them together as a way to introduce Paul to other Japanese people and to demonstrate the possibilities for friendship between former enemies. These games were covered by Japanese newspapers and magazines, and they became symbols of the broader reconciliation that was taking place between Japan and the United States. The success of Paul's visit to Japan inspired other veterans from both countries to seek out former enemies and attempt to build bridges across the divide created by war. Some of these efforts were unsuccessful, as not everyone was ready or able to move beyond the bitterness and trauma of conflict, but enough succeeded to create a small but significant movement toward person-to-person reconciliation that complemented the official diplomatic efforts being conducted by both governments. Takeda and Paul maintained their friendship through regular correspondence for the rest of their lives, sharing news about their families, their careers, and their ongoing efforts to promote understanding between their countries. Their letters were filled with references to baseball, but they also covered topics ranging from politics and economics to philosophy and religion. In 1959, Paul was able to arrange for Takeda to visit the United States as part of a cultural exchange program sponsored by the State Department. Takeda's tour included stops at several universities where he spoke about his experiences as a prisoner of war and the transformation that had taken place through the baseball program at Honolulu. The most meaningful part of Takeda's American visit was his trip to Nebraska, where he stayed with Paul's family on their farm and experienced firsthand the rural American life that had shaped his friend's character and values. Takeda helped with farm work, attended local baseball games, and spoke to students at the high school where Paul had returned to teaching after the war. The visit to Nebraska was particularly significant because it allowed Takeda to understand the cultural context that had made Paul's gesture of friendship possible. He saw how baseball was woven into the fabric of American community life, how the sport served as a vehicle for teaching values like teamwork, fair play, and respect for opponents. This understanding helped him appreciate why Paul had been able to see beyond their official roles as guard and prisoner to recognize their shared humanity. During his stay on the farm, Takeda also met some of Paul's former students who had gone on to serve in the Korean War. These young men were struggling with their own experiences of combat and captivity, and Takeda's stories about finding friendship with former enemies provided them with hope that their sacrifices had contributed to something positive and lasting. The friendship between Takeda and Paul became a model for other prisoner-guard relationships that had developed during the war. Several other former participants in the Honolulu baseball program re-established contact with each other in the 1950s and 60s, creating an informal network of people who shared the experience of finding humanity in the midst of conflict. Some of these relationships led to business partnerships as Japan rebuilt its economy and began trading extensively with the United States. Others resulted in educational exchanges, with former prisoners and guards working together to develop programs that would help future generations understand the importance of seeing individual people rather than national stereotypes. The baseball program at Honolulu also influenced the development of sports diplomacy as a tool for international relations. Government officials on both sides began to recognize that athletic competitions and cultural exchanges could accomplish diplomatic objectives that were difficult to achieve through formal negotiations and treaties. This recognition led to the establishment of various programs that use sports as a vehicle for building relationships between former enemies and potential allies. The success of these programs could be traced directly back to the informal baseball games that had begun when Paul Henderson tossed a glove over a chain-link fence to a Japanese pilot who was watching with curiosity and longing. As the years passed, the story of the Honolulu baseball program became part of the historical record of World War II and its aftermath. Military historians included it in their accounts of prisoner-of-war operations, while social scientists studied it as an example of how human relationships could develop even under the most challenging circumstances. But for the participants themselves, the historical significance was less important than the personal transformation they had experienced. Men who had been trained to hate and kill each other had discovered that they shared fundamental human qualities that transcended nationality, ideology, and military conflict. Paul Henderson continued teaching until his retirement in 1978, and he never stopped telling his students about the Japanese prisoners who had taught him about the power of sport to build bridges between people. His classroom walls were covered with photographs from the baseball games at Honolulu, along with letters and gifts from his Japanese friends. Takeda remained active in veterans organizations and reconciliation efforts until his death in 1985. His writings about the baseball program were eventually collected and published as a book that became required reading in many Japanese schools, helping to educate new generations about the possibilities for friendship, even in the aftermath of bitter conflict. The legacy of their friendship extended to their children and grandchildren, many of whom maintained connections across the Pacific that had been established by their fathers and grandfathers. These relationships represented a living testament to the idea that individual human connections could overcome even the most profound political and cultural divisions. In the end, the baseball program at Honolulu demonstrated something that military strategists and diplomatic experts had not fully understood. That lasting peace requires more than treaties and formal agreements. It requires personal relationships between individual people who are willing to see past official roles and national identities to recognize their shared humanity. When Paul Henderson first tossed that baseball glove over the fence to Shoji Takeda, he was acting on instinct rather than policy, responding to a simple human desire to share something he loved with someone who seemed interested in learning. Neither man could have imagined that this spontaneous gesture would become a model for post-conflict reconciliation that would influence international relations for decades to come. The story of their friendship, and the broader baseball program that grew from it, serves as a reminder that some of the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen not in formal conference rooms, but on playing fields where former enemies can discover that they have more in common than they ever realized. In the simple act of playing catch, teaching each other new skills, and celebrating each other's successes, American guards and Japanese prisoners created something that no amount of official policy could have achieved: genuine understanding and lasting friendship between people who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The baseball diamond at Honolulu, improvised from the dusty ground between prison barracks and guard quarters, became a symbol of hope that even the deepest divisions between people and nations could be bridged through patience, goodwill, and the recognition that sports, laughter, and friendship are universal human experiences that transcend all boundaries. The ripple effects of the Honolulu baseball program continued to spread throughout the 1960s and 70s, as the children of the original participants began to understand the full significance of what their fathers had accomplished. Paul Henderson's son, David, grew up hearing stories about the Japanese prisoners who had become his father's friends, and these tales shaped his own worldview in profound ways. David Henderson became fascinated with Japanese culture and language, eventually pursuing graduate studies in East Asian history at the University of California. His doctoral dissertation examined the role of cultural exchange programs in post-war reconciliation, using his father's experiences at Honolulu as a central case study. The research brought him into contact with Takeda's son Hiroshi, who had followed a similar path of interest in American culture and international relations. The younger generation's connection proved even stronger than their father's friendship had been, perhaps because it was built on shared academic interests rather than forged in the crucible of war and captivity. David and Hiroshi collaborated on research projects, co-authored articles about their father's experiences, and eventually established a foundation dedicated to promoting international understanding through sports and cultural exchange. The Henderson-Takeda Foundation, established in 1976, became a leading organization in the field of sports diplomacy. It sponsored youth baseball exchanges between American and Japanese communities, provided scholarships for students interested in studying cross-cultural relations, and supported research into the role of recreational activities in conflict resolution. One of the Foundation's most successful programs was the annual Honolulu Cup, a baseball tournament that brought together teams from Hawaii, the continental United States, and Japan. The tournament was held each summer at a specially constructed field near the site of the former internment camp, and it attracted participants from around the world who were interested in learning about the historical significance of the location. The Honolulu Cup became more than just a baseball tournament. It evolved into a comprehensive educational experience that included workshops on conflict resolution, presentations by historians and social scientists, and opportunities for participants to meet veterans of World War II from both sides of the Pacific conflict. Many former prisoners and guards attended these events, sharing their memories and insights with younger generations who had no direct experience of war. Dr. Margaret Chen, a psychologist who studied the tournament's impact on participants, documented remarkable changes in attitudes and perceptions among young people who attended the event. We consistently observed that participants left the Honolulu Cup with a more nuanced understanding of history and a greater appreciation for the complexity of human relationships, she wrote in a 1982 research paper. The combination of athletic competition and historical education created a unique learning environment that was more effective than traditional classroom instruction. The success of the Honolulu Cup inspired similar programs in other parts of the world where sports were being used to promote reconciliation between former enemies. In Ireland, cricket matches brought together Protestant and Catholic communities. In the Middle East, soccer tournaments provided neutral ground for Arab and Israeli youth to interact. In Africa, basketball programs helped bridge tribal and ethnic divisions that had fueled civil conflicts. These programs all traced their intellectual lineage back to the informal baseball games that had begun when Paul Henderson threw a glove over a fence to Shoji Takeda. The simple recognition that shared activities could create bonds stronger than political differences had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how sports could be systematically used to promote peace and understanding. The academic study of sports diplomacy became a legitimate field of research, with universities offering courses and degree programs that examined the intersection of athletics, international relations, and conflict resolution. The Onyuliuli baseball program was featured in countless textbooks and case studies, analyzed by scholars who sought to understand exactly how and why it had been so successful. Professor James Morrison of Georgetown University, who became one of the leading experts in the field, identified several key factors that had made the Onyuliuli program particularly effective. First, he wrote, the activity was genuinely voluntary on both sides. Neither the prisoners nor the guards were compelled to participate, which meant that everyone involved was there because they wanted to be. Second, the sport itself was unfamiliar to the CI Japanese participants, which created a natural teaching and learning dynamic that broke down traditional power relationships. Third, the daily repetition of the activity allowed relationships to develop gradually and naturally, without the pressure of formal diplomatic protocols. End quote. Morrison's analysis also emphasized the importance of individual personalities in the program's success. Paul Henderson and Shoji Takeda were uniquely suited to serve as bridges between their respective communities, he observed. Both men possessed the intelligence, empathy, and courage necessary to take risks in pursuit of human connection. Without their willingness to move beyond conventional boundaries, the entire program might never have developed. This focus on individual agency became a central theme in sports diplomacy programs around the world. Organizers learned that successful cross-cultural athletic exchanges required identifying and empowering individuals who possessed the personal qualities necessary to build bridges across divides. These bridge builders became the key to transforming competitive activities into opportunities for genuine understanding and friendship. The impact of the Onyuliuli program was also felt in unexpected areas of American society. Veterans organizations began incorporating recreational activities into their rehabilitation and support programs, recognizing that shared athletic experiences could help former soldiers process trauma and build new relationships with civilian communities. The Department of Veterans Affairs commissioned a comprehensive study of recreational therapy programs in 1979. And the research team specifically examined the Onyuliuli baseball program as a historical precedent for using sports to promote healing and reconciliation. The study's conclusions led to the expansion of recreational therapy offerings at VA hospitals and the development of new programs that brought together veterans from different conflicts and eras. Captain Robert Williams, a Vietnam War veteran who participated in one of these programs, described the experience in terms that echoed the language used by Onyuliuli participants decades earlier. Playing softball with guys who had served in Korea in World War II helped me understand that the feelings I was struggling with weren't unique to Vietnam, he said. We had all faced similar challenges in different wars, and working together as a team gave us a way to support each other without having to talk directly about the difficult stuff. The therapeutic potential of athletic activities also began to influence international humanitarian efforts. Organizations working in refugee camps and post-conflict zones started incorporating sports programs into their relief efforts, recognizing that recreational activities could provide psychological benefits that were just as important as food, shelter, and medical care. Dr. Sarah Johnson, who worked with Cambodian refugees in Thailand during the 1980s, implemented a soccer program that drew directly on lessons learned from the Onyuliuli baseball experience. We found that organized sports gave refugees a sense of normalcy and community that was crucial for their psychological recovery, she reported. The games provided structure, social interaction, and physical activity that helped people begin to rebuild their lives. These refugee camp programs faced challenges that the Onyuliuli organizers had never encountered. Language barriers were often more complex, with participants speaking multiple languages that none of the aid workers understood. Cultural differences were more pronounced, as refugees came from various ethnic and religious backgrounds that had little in common. And the trauma levels were often more severe, as many participants had experienced recent violence and displacement. Despite these difficulties, the fundamental principles that had made the Onyuliuli program successful proved to be remarkably adaptable. The key insights remained constant: voluntary participation, patient relationship building, and focus on shared activities rather than political differences could create bonds that transcended even the most challenging circumstances. The success of these humanitarian applications led to the formal incorporation of sports programs into international development and peace-building efforts. The United Nations began funding athletic programs in conflict zones, and major aid organizations added sports coordinators to their staff. The simple idea that had emerged from a prisoner of war camp in Hawaii had become part of the standard toolkit for international humanitarian work. Meanwhile, back in Hawaii, efforts were underway to preserve the physical site of the Honolulu camp and commemorate the remarkable events that had taken place there. The camp buildings had been demolished shortly after the war, and the land had been returned to agricultural use. But in the 1980s, historians and community activists began advocating for the creation of a memorial that would preserve the memory of both the injustices and the triumphs that had occurred on the site. The Hawaii Japanese Cultural Center took the lead in organizing preservation efforts, working with former prisoners, guards, and their families to develop a comprehensive plan for commemorating the camp's history. The project faced initial resistance from some community members who preferred to focus on the negative aspects of internment rather than the positive relationships that had developed between prisoners and guards. Mary Tanaka, whose father had been interned at Honolulu as a civilian suspect rather than a military prisoner, initially opposed the memorial project. "I thought it was wrong to celebrate anything that happened at a place where innocent people were held against their will," she explained years later. "But when I learned more about the baseball program and the friendships that developed there, I realized that the story was more complicated than I had understood." Tanaka's change of heart reflected a broader evolution in how Hawaiian communities understood the legacy of the Honolulu camp. Rather than viewing the internment as a simple story of victimization and injustice, people began to appreciate the complex human dynamics that had unfolded there and the positive lessons that could be drawn from even, quote, tragic circumstances. The memorial project eventually received support from both the Hawaiian and Japanese governments, as well as from veterans organizations and educational institutions throughout the Pacific region. The design incorporated elements that honored both the suffering of internment and the hope represented by the baseball program and other cultural exchange activities. The centerpiece of the memorial was a recreation of the baseball diamond where Paul Henderson and Shoji Takeda had first played catch. The field was constructed using authentic materials and techniques from the 1940s, and it included interpretive displays that told the story of how athletic activities had transformed relationships between prisoners and guards. Visitors to the memorial could walk the base paths where former enemies had learned to see each other as fellow human beings, and they could read first-hand accounts of the friendships that had developed through shared love of sport. The memorial also included a museum that displayed artifacts from the camp, including baseball equipment, letters between former participants, and photographs documenting the evolution of the cultural bea exchange program. The Honolulu Memorial was dedicated in 1991, on the 50th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. The ceremony brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the camp's history, including several surviving participants in the baseball program. Paul Henderson, now in his 70s, threw out the ceremonial first pitch on the recreated diamond, using the same glove he had given to Takeda nearly half a century earlier. Takeda had passed away 6 years earlier, but his son Hiroshi was present to catch the pitch, creating a moment of connection between past and present that moved many spectators to tears. The dedication ceremony also featured the first game of what would become an annual tradition, a baseball match between teams representing the values and spirit of the original Honolulu program. These games brought together players from diverse backgrounds who were committed to using sports as a vehicle for promoting understanding and friendship. The annual Memorial Games became increasingly sophisticated over the years, eventually incorporating teams from around the world that represented different approaches to sports diplomacy and conflict resolution. The competition was always secondary to the educational and relationship-building objectives, but the quality of play was remarkably high, as participants took seriously the responsibility of honoring the legacy of the original program. International media coverage of the Memorial Games helped spread awareness of the Anyuliuli story to audiences who had never heard of the camp or its baseball program. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and authors began producing works that brought the story to new generations and different cultural contexts. One particularly influential documentary, The Game That Changed Everything, was broadcast on public television stations throughout the United States and Japan in 1995. The film included interviews with surviving participants, historical analysis from academic experts, and contemporary footage of sports diplomacy programs that had been inspired by the Anyuliuli experience. The documentary's impact was amplified by an accompanying educational curriculum that was distributed to schools throughout the Pacific region. Teachers used the Anyuliuli story to help students understand complex historical and social concepts, including the nature of prejudice, the possibility of reconciliation, and the role of individual actions in shaping historical outcomes. Jennifer Martinez, a high school history teacher in Los Angeles, described the curriculum's effectiveness. The Anyuliuli story gives students a concrete example of how ordinary people can overcome extraordinary challenges through empathy and shared activities. It's much more powerful than abstract discussions about tolerance and understanding, because it shows real people making real choices with real consequences." End quote. The educational impact of the Anyuliuli story was further enhanced by the development of exchange programs that allowed students to visit the memorial site and participate in hands-on learning grin experiences. These programs brought together young people from the United States, Japan, and other Pacific nations to learn about the historical events while also participating in their own cross-cultural athletic activities. Dr. Michael Chang, who directed one of these exchange programs, observed remarkable similarities between the experiences of contemporary students and the original Anyuliuli participants. "We consistently see the same pattern," he noted. Students arrive with preconceptions and stereotypes about people from other cultures, but after a few days of playing sports together and sharing meals, those barriers begin to break down. The power of shared experience to create understanding is just as strong today as it was 70 years ago. End quote. These educational exchanges also provided opportunities for researchers to study the mechanisms by which athletic activities promote cross-cultural understanding. Social psychologists, anthropologists, and international relations scholars used the programs as natural laboratories for testing theories about contact hypothesis, social identity, and conflict resolution. The research findings consistently supported the conclusions that had been drawn from the original Anyuliuli experience. Prolonged contact between members of different groups, under conditions of equal status and common goals, led to reduced prejudice and increased empathy. The competitive element of sports, rather than creating additional conflict, actually enhanced these positive effects by providing clear criteria for evaluating individual performance rather than group or membership. Professor Lisa Wong of Stanford University, who conducted longitudinal studies of exchange program participants, found that the effects persisted long after the initial contact experience. Students who participated in our sports-based cultural exchange programs showed measurably different attitudes toward international cooperation and conflict resolution 5 years later, she reported. The experience of forming friendships across cultural boundaries during adolescence seems to create lasting openness to cross-cultural relationships. These research findings had practical implications for international education policy and diplomatic strategy. Government agencies and non-governmental organizations began incorporating sports-based programming into their cultural exchange efforts, recognizing that athletic activities could accelerate relationship-building processes that might otherwise take months or years to develop. The United States Information Agency, which managed many of the country's public diplomacy programs, established a sports diplomacy division in 1993. The division's mission was to identify and support athletic exchanges that could promote American values and build relationships with key international audiences. The division's first major initiative was a global baseball program that sent American coaches and players to countries where the sport was relatively unknown. The program drew explicitly on the Anyuliuli model, emphasizing patient instruction, cultural sensitivity, and the building of personal relationships rather than simply promoting American athletic trait. Superiority. Similar programs were established by other countries that recognized the diplomatic potential of sports exchanges. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs created a martial arts diplomacy program that introduced judo and karate to international audiences while promoting Japanese values of discipline, respect, and peaceful conflict resolution. These government-sponsored programs achieved varying degrees of success, but the most effective ones adhered closely to the principles that had made the Honolulu baseball program successful: voluntary participation, genuine cultural exchange, and focus on individual relationships rather than national propaganda. The legacy of Honolulu also influenced the development of corporate social responsibility programs that used sports to promote community development and international understanding. Multinational corporations with operations in multiple countries began sponsoring athletic exchanges that brought together employees from different cultural backgrounds. Toyota Motor Corporation, which had significant operations in both Japan and the United States, established an annual softball tournament that rotated between manufacturing facilities in different countries. The tournament provided opportunities for employees to build relationships across national and cultural boundaries, while also promoting company values of teamwork and continuous improvement. The program's success led other corporations to develop similar initiatives, creating a network of private sector sports diplomacy programs that complemented government and non-governmental efforts. These corporate programs often had advantages over official diplomatic initiatives because they were perceived as less political and more focused on practical cooperation. The influence of the Honolulu story even extended into professional sports, where athletes and organizations began to recognize their potential role as unofficial ambassadors for international understanding. Major League Baseball established a Goodwill Ambassador program that sent current and former players to countries where baseball was developing, with explicit instructions to promote not just the sport, but also American values of diversity, opportunity, and fair play. The National Basketball Association created similar programs for basketball, while the National Football League developed initiatives focused on leadership development and community service. These programs acknowledged that professional athletes had unique credibility and visibility that could be leveraged for diplomatic purposes. The most successful of these professional sports diplomacy initiatives maintained clear connections to the grassroots approach that had characterized the original Honolulu program. Rather than focusing on high-profile exhibitions and celebrity appearances, the most effective programs emphasized instruction, relationship building, and genuine cultural exchange at the community level. As the 20th century drew to a close, the story of the Honolulu baseball program had evolved from a historical curiosity into a foundational case study for an entire field of international relations practice. Universities offered graduate degrees in sports diplomacy. Government agencies had dedicated staff working on athletic exchange programs, and international organizations regularly incorporated sports programming into their peace-building and development efforts. The transformation was remarkable, considering that it had all begun with a simple gesture of friendship between two men who found themselves on opposite sides of a chain-link fence in a remote corner of Hawaii. Paul Henderson's decision to throw a baseball glove to Shoji Takeda had created ripple effects that continued to influence international relations more than 50 years later. Yet for all the academic analysis and policy development that had grown from their experience, the core message of the Honolulu story remained elegantly simple. Human beings have a natural capacity for friendship and understanding that can overcome even the most profound political and cultural differences. All that is required is the courage to reach across divides and the patience to build relationships, one interaction at a time. The baseball diamond, where it all began, carefully preserved and maintained at the Honolulu Memorial, stood as a testament to this enduring truth. Visitors from around the world continued to come to the site, drawn by a story that offered hope for resolution of contemporary conflicts and proof that individual actions could have historical significance. The memorial's guestbook contained entries in dozens of languages, written by people who had traveled from every continent to see the place where former enemies had learned to become friends. Their comments reflected a consistent theme: amazement at the power of simple human kindness to transform relationships and create possibilities for peace, even in the most challenging circumstances. Standing on that dusty field in Hawaii, looking at the mountains where American guards and Japanese prisoners had once gathered to play a game that none of them fully understood, visitors could almost hear the echoes of laughter and friendly competition that had changed the course of history one pitch at a time.